In the early hours of 1950, the Cold War found its first real battlefield, not in Berlin, not in Paris, on a peninsula where a single line separated peace from war. Somewhere in Washington, a telephone rang in the darkness. A duty officer reached for the receiver, listened for a moment, then sat upright. The cable in front of him described something that was not a border incident, not a skirmish, not a probe. He reached for another phone and began the chain of calls that would pull senior officials from their weekend activities and set in motion decisions that could not be reversed. Within hours, maps were being unfolded on conference tables. Coffee was being brewed in offices that should have been empty. The machinery of crisis response, dormant on a summer Saturday, lurched into motion with the particular urgency that comes when theory becomes reality. For 5 years after the defeat of the Axis powers, the confrontation between Washington and Moscow had been fought with words, with pressure, with crises that stopped short of open combat. Berlin had been a test of wills. Europe had been a contest of reconstruction and alliance. Asia had seen a civil war end in ways that shocked American planners. But nowhere had American and communist forces met in direct, sustained, lethal conflict. That changed in the summer of 1950. On a peninsula that most Americans could not find on a map, the abstract logic of containment became a concrete choice. Send troops or watch an ally fall. Fight or accept that aggression would be rewarded. Risk escalation or accept retreat. This is the story of how that choice was made. Not as a military history of campaigns and casualties, but as a story of decisions under pressure, of a superpower discovering that the doctrines it had developed on paper would now be tested in blood, of the moment when the Cold War stopped being cold. Archival records and diplomatic cables from this period reveal a government caught between competing fears. The fear of doing too little and watching credibility collapse across Asia. The fear of doing too much and triggering a wider war that no one wanted. The officials who gathered in emergency meetings in the days after the attack understood that either path carried enormous risks. Years later, participants would describe the atmosphere as electric with urgency and uncertainty. The plans they had made for hypothetical scenarios suddenly had to be executed for real. The theories they had debated in conference rooms now had consequences measured in lives. This is not an episode about every battle or every decision of a war that would last 3 years. It is an episode about the beginning, about why it started, why it mattered, and why the response shaped everything that followed. About the moment when containment stopped being a strategy document and became a commitment that could not be reversed. The line on the map that had seemed stable was, in truth, a trigger waiting to be pulled. The first war of the Cold War began as a crossing of a border. To understand why a peninsula in Northeast Asia became the first battlefield of the Cold War, you have to understand the world that emerged from the Second World War. A world that looked like peace but was already organizing itself for a new kind of conflict. The alliance that had defeated the Axis powers was never a partnership of shared values. It was a marriage of necessity against a common enemy. The United States and the Soviet Union had fought on the same side, but they had never fought for the same vision of what the post-war world should look like. America emerged from the war as the dominant economic power on Earth. Its factories were intact. Its cities were undamaged. Its farms could feed not just its own population but much of the devastated world. Its financial institutions held the reserves that would underwrite reconstruction. This position brought both opportunity and responsibility. American planners saw a world that desperately needed stability and recovery. They understood that the collapse of the old order had created a vacuum that someone would fill. They believed that American leadership could shape the rebuilding in ways that prevented another catastrophic war, that created conditions for trade and prosperity, that built an international order where disputes could be resolved without the devastation that had twice engulfed the century. The goal was not conquest but prevention. Prevent another depression, prevent another world war. Prevent the chaos that bred extremism. The Soviet Union emerged from the war devastated but victorious. The human cost had been staggering, losses that dwarfed what any other Allied nation had suffered. Cities lay in ruins. Industries had been destroyed or relocated under desperate wartime conditions. The agricultural base had been ravaged. But the Red Army had fought its way to Berlin, and the prestige of that victory was immense. Soviet leaders looked at the post-war world through the lens of their own experience and their own ideology. They saw an American power that seemed determined to reshape the world in its own image. They saw the atomic monopoly as a threat held over their heads. They saw the network of bases and alliances forming around them as encirclement. Their response was to consolidate what they had gained and to view every American initiative with suspicion. In a planning office in Washington, analysts worked to understand what Soviet intentions might be. The maps on the walls showed a world in flux. The reports on the desks described a rival whose capabilities were uncertain and whose ultimate goals were debated endlessly. A senior analyst drafted an assessment that would go to policymakers. He chose his words carefully, knowing that his conclusions would shape decisions with enormous consequences. The Soviet Union, he wrote, should be understood as both a traditional great power pursuing security and an ideological movement pursuing transformation. The combination made it uniquely difficult to predict and uniquely important to contain. The assessment went through review and revision. Different readers emphasized different elements. The final document reflected the fundamental uncertainty that all intelligence products of this era shared. They were trying to understand a closed society through fragmentary evidence, interpreting actions through frameworks that might or might not capture what was really happening in the Kremlin. What was clear was that the wartime alliance had dissolved into something very different. Each side saw the other as a threat. Each side interpreted the other's actions through a lens of suspicion. Each side took steps to strengthen its own position that the other side saw as aggressive. The spiral of mistrust fed on itself, making cooperation harder and confrontation more likely with each passing month. Both sides engaged in propaganda that portrayed the other as the source of all danger. Both sides conducted internal campaigns against suspected sympathizers with the enemy. The vocabulary of enmity became normalized. The possibility of genuine accommodation became harder to imagine. In a newsroom in an American city, editors worked to explain the global situation to readers who were still adjusting to their country's new role in the world. Maps were being redrawn for every edition. The graphics department struggled to keep up with the pace of events. An editor reviewed the latest wire reports and made decisions about what would go on the front page. Make it clear, he told his staff. Make it simple. The readers need to understand what is at stake. The Cold War was becoming a story that Americans would live with for decades. The newsroom's job was to help them understand it. With the old enemy defeated, the new enemy became the center of politics on both sides. The Korean peninsula occupied a position of strategic significance that its size did not immediately suggest. It jutted southward from the Asian mainland, pointing toward Japan like a dagger. The waters around it connected the Sea of Japan to the Yellow Sea. Any power that controlled the peninsula could project influence in multiple directions. Any power that lost control of it would face threats from new angles. For centuries, Korea had been contested by larger neighbors. China, Japan, and Russia had all sought influence or control over this territory that lay at the intersection of their interests. The Korean people had maintained their distinct identity through all of this, but their political fate had often been determined by the outcomes of great power competition rather than their own choices. The end of the Second World War brought a new chapter in this long history of external involvement. Japan's defeat meant that its colonial control over Korea would end. But what would replace it was decided not by Koreans, but by the victorious allies who were already beginning to eye each other with suspicion. The solution that emerged was meant to be temporary. American and Soviet forces would occupy different parts of the peninsula, with a line drawn roughly at the 38th parallel. The North would be administered under Soviet supervision while a new political order was established. The South would be administered under American supervision for the same purpose. Eventually, the thinking went, a unified Korean government would be established, and the occupying powers would withdraw. But temporary arrangements have a way of becoming permanent when the powers involved cannot agree on what should replace them. As relations between Washington and Moscow deteriorated, the prospects for Korean unification deteriorated with them. The division that was meant to last months stretched into years. The line that was meant to be administrative became political. The two zones developed into two states with incompatible systems and incompatible patrons. In a village near the dividing line, residents watched as the temporary became the permanent. Families that had been separated by the line found that crossing it became first difficult, then dangerous, then impossible. The world they had known, where the peninsula was a single if divided space, gave way to a world where two armed camps faced each other across an increasingly militarized boundary. At military posts along the line, soldiers from both sides watched each other with binoculars and rifles. Small incidents occurred with regularity. Patrols clashed in disputed areas. Shots were exchanged across the line. Each side accused the other of provocation and aggression. The line that was supposed to maintain order became a source of constant friction and occasional violence. American military advisors worked with the Southern forces, training them and assessing their capabilities. The reports they sent back to Washington were not encouraging. In a cramped office at an advisory headquarters, an American officer drafted his latest assessment. The Army of the South was improving, he acknowledged. Training programs were having some effect. Discipline was better than it had been a year ago. But the fundamental problems remained. The force lacked heavy weapons that would be essential in conventional combat. Tanks were few and outdated. Artillery was insufficient for the defensive tasks that might be required. The officer corps was inexperienced, many of them political appointees rather than proven combat leaders. The enlisted ranks were filled with conscripts whose motivation varied widely. He wrote a sentence that captured his professional judgment. If war comes, this force will need substantial external support within days, or it will be overwhelmed. He knew the sentence would not be welcomed in Washington. He wrote it anyway because it was true. In the North, different preparations were underway. The forces that were being built with Soviet assistance into something more formidable. The equipment was better, including tanks and artillery that the South could not match. The training was more intensive and more unified. The leadership had combat experience from other conflicts. If the decision was made to move, they would move with capability that the South could not counter on its own. Intelligence assessments noted the buildup with growing concern. But intelligence assessments had noted many things over the years that had not resulted in war. The assumption in Washington was that the line would hold because neither side wanted the escalation that crossing it would bring. The assumption was about to be tested. When a border is born from compromise rather than peace, it becomes a trigger waiting for the right pressure. The attack came in the darkness before dawn on June 25, 1950. It was not a probing action or a limited incursion. It was a full-scale invasion designed to overwhelm the defenders and present the world with a fait accompli before any effective response could be organized. Artillery opened the assault, pounding positions along the line with a weight of fire that the defenders had never experienced. Then armored columns began to move, Soviet-made tanks rolling southward against forces that had little capability to stop them. Infantry followed in strength that the Southern defenders could not hope to match. The defenders fought back where they could, but they were outgunned and outmaneuvered at every point. Within hours, the line that had held for 5 years was collapsing. Within days, the capital would be in danger of falling. In Washington, the first reports arrived in the early hours of a Saturday evening. A duty officer at the State Department received a cable from the embassy describing the situation in urgent terms. He read it once, then read it again to make sure he understood what he was seeing. Then he reached for the telephone. The calls went up the chain of command with increasing speed. The Secretary of State was located at his home. The Secretary of Defense was informed at a dinner party. The President, who was at his family home in Missouri, received word that something serious was happening on the other side of the world. In the hours that followed, more information arrived. The picture became clearer and more alarming with each update. This was not a border skirmish that would burn itself out. This was an invasion aimed at conquest. The forces of the North were advancing rapidly on multiple axes. The forces of the South were in retreat that threatened to become rout. Without intervention, the entire peninsula would fall within weeks or possibly days. A senior advisor gathered his staff for an emergency assessment. The conference room filled with officials who had been summoned from weekend activities, some still in casual clothes, all wearing expressions of intense focus. Maps were spread across tables. Cables were distributed and read aloud. The questions came fast, each one revealing how much was still unknown. How large were the attacking forces? Larger than expected, came the answer. Several divisions with armor support. How were the defenders holding? They were not holding. They were retreating, in some sectors in disorder. What were the Soviets doing? Unknown, but there was no indication of direct Soviet military involvement yet. What were the Chinese doing? Also unknown, but no sign of movement from that direction. What were our options? That was the question everyone was there to answer. The President boarded an aircraft for the flight back to Washington. The hours in the air gave him time to think about what was unfolding and what it would require. In the quiet cabin, with aides nearby but giving him space, he reviewed the situation as he understood it. He had lived through the failures of appeasement in the 1930s. He remembered how the democracies had watched aggression succeed, how each concession had encouraged the next demand, how the failure to act early had made the eventual conflict far more costly than early action would have been. He was not inclined to let the pattern repeat on his watch. He made notes on a pad of paper, organizing his thoughts for the meetings that would follow. The handwriting was firm. The conclusions were forming even before the plane touched down. This would require a response. The only questions were what kind of response and how quickly it could be mounted. The meeting at Blair House brought together the key figures who would shape the American response. The atmosphere was tense but focused. There was no time for extended debate about abstract principles. Decisions had to be made quickly or events would make them irrelevant. The fundamental question was stark. Would the United States intervene militarily to stop the invasion? Or would it accept the loss of South Korea, and whatever consequences followed from that acceptance? The arguments for intervention were compelling and were stated clearly by multiple voices around the table. The credibility of American commitments was at stake. If Washington allowed an ally to be overrun without response, what would other allies conclude about the value of American protection? Japan, the Philippines, the nations of Southeast Asia, the partners in Europe, all would be watching. If containment meant nothing in Korea, why would anyone believe it meant anything anywhere else? The entire structure of post-war security could unravel from a single thread. The arguments for caution were also real, and they deserved consideration. Intervention meant war. War meant casualties, American casualties, in a conflict that would be difficult and uncertain. War meant the risk of escalation if other powers decided to intervene on the other side. The forces immediately available in the region were limited. Reinforcement would take time. The outcome of a military commitment was not guaranteed. But in that room, on that night, the weight of argument fell decisively toward action. The risk of inaction seemed greater than the risk of action. The damage to American credibility from standing aside seemed greater than the costs of standing firm. The decision was made to respond with force. The mechanics of response would take time to organize. Forces would have to be moved across the Pacific. Allies would have to be consulted and their support secured. The legal and political framework for action would have to be established. But the fundamental choice had been made in those first hours. The United States would fight. Containment stopped being a document. It became a choice with consequences that could not be taken back. The decision to respond through the United Nations was not simply a matter of legal nicety. It was a strategic choice that reflected hard thinking about how to maximize the legitimacy and sustainability of the intervention. Going to war unilaterally would have been faster and simpler. The president had significant authority to commit forces without waiting for international approval. American power was sufficient to act alone if necessary. But speed was not the only consideration. The nature of the response mattered as much as the fact of the response. Acting through the United Nations would frame the intervention as a collective response to aggression rather than an American adventure. It would distribute the political costs among multiple nations. It would provide legal cover that would make the commitment more sustainable over time. It would present the conflict to the world as a defense of international order rather than a projection of American power. The problem was that the United Nations Security Council included the Soviet Union as a permanent member with veto power. Under normal circumstances, Moscow would simply block any resolution authorizing force against a state that was aligned with the Soviet bloc. The intervention would die in the Security Council before it could be born. But the circumstances in June 1950 were not normal. The Soviet Union was boycotting the Security Council. The boycott had begun months earlier, a protest over the Council's refusal to seat the new government in Beijing, rather than the representatives of the government that had fled to Taiwan. Soviet diplomats had walked out and had not returned. The reasons for this decision and its timing remain subjects of historical debate. The archives that might provide definitive answers have not been fully opened. Some historians suggest it was a miscalculation, that Moscow did not expect the invasion to trigger such a rapid American response through the UN. Others suggest more complex motivations that may never be fully understood. What mattered was the result. The seat was empty, and the window was real. In the Security Council chamber, delegates gathered for what everyone understood was an extraordinary session. The gallery was full. The interpreters were ready. The tension was palpable. In the corridors outside the chamber, delegates hurried between consultations, their footsteps echoing on marble floors. Translators worked to ensure that instructions from capitals were understood correctly. The urgency of the moment pressed on everyone. Decisions that would normally take weeks of negotiation would have to be made in hours. The American representative laid out the case for action in clear and forceful terms. An act of aggression had occurred. A member state of the United Nations had been invaded without provocation or justification. The principles on which the organization had been founded were at stake. If the United Nations failed to respond, those principles would be exposed as empty words, and the organization itself would be revealed as impotent in the face of exactly the kind of aggression it had been created to prevent. Other delegates spoke in support. The representatives of allied nations expressed solidarity with the American position. The machinery of international diplomacy, usually so slow and so deliberate, moved with unusual speed. The vote came quickly. Resolution after resolution passed without the veto that would normally have stopped them. The Security Council called for a ceasefire and withdrawal. When the ceasefire was ignored, the Council authorized member states to provide assistance to repel the attack. The legal framework for international military action was established in a matter of days. In the Soviet Foreign Ministry, officials assessed the situation with growing alarm. The boycott that had been intended as a gesture of protest had created an opening that the Americans had exploited with unexpected skill and speed. The resolutions passing through the Security Council gave the intervention a legitimacy that unilateral American action would not have possessed. The Soviet absence had been transformed from a statement of principle into a strategic liability. The decision was made to return to the Council. But by then, the critical resolutions had been passed. The framework for action had been established. The legal and political architecture of the intervention was in place. The opportunity to block it had passed. The decision was for war, but the packaging was law, and the packaging mattered. The commitment to fight raised immediate questions about how to fight. The challenge was not simply military, it was conceptual. How do you wage a war that you do not want to escalate into something larger? How do you use enough force to achieve your objectives without crossing lines that would trigger responses you cannot control? This was genuinely new territory. The wars of the past had generally been fought with the goal of total victory. You mobilized everything you had. You sought to destroy the enemy's capacity to resist. You fought until one side or the other was exhausted or destroyed. The logic was straightforward even when the execution was brutal. But 1950 was not 1945. The world had changed in ways that demanded new thinking. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. The balance of terror that would define the Cold War for decades was already beginning to take shape. A war that escalated out of control could become something that no one wanted and that everyone would regret if anyone survived to feel regret. The concept that emerged was what strategists would later call limited war. Fight hard enough to achieve specific objectives. But do not pursue those objectives so aggressively that you force the other side into responses that spiral beyond anyone's control. Win the battle you are fighting without triggering the catastrophe you are trying to prevent. In planning rooms at the Pentagon, officers wrestled with how to translate this concept into operational reality. The maps showed the Korean peninsula in detail. The arrows showed the current lines of advance and retreat. The question was what outcome to seek and what limits to accept. The discussion was intense and sometimes heated. The goal should be restoration of the status quo, some argued. Push the invaders back to where they started. Demonstrate that aggression would not be rewarded. Re-establish the line. But do not pursue goals so ambitious that they provoke intervention by other powers who might feel threatened. Others pushed back against self-imposed limitations. Wars are not won by announcing in advance where you will stop. If you fight with one hand tied behind your back, you give the enemy advantages he has not earned. Victory should be the goal. Everything else was compromise. A senior civilian official who had been listening to the debate intervened. He brought the perspective of those who would have to explain the policy to Congress, to allies, and to the American public. The American people would support a war to defend an ally, he said. They would understand the principle of responding to aggression. They had just lived through a war fought on similar principles, but they would not understand a war without clear and achievable objectives. They would not accept casualties that did not lead towards something they could recognize as success. The military plans had to be designed with political sustainability in mind from the beginning. The planning continued through long days and longer nights. Objectives were defined and redefined as the situation on the ground evolved. Contingencies were mapped out for scenarios that might or might not materialize. The question of what to do if other powers intervened directly was discussed repeatedly without reaching satisfying answers. The uncertainty was irreducible. They were planning for a situation that had never existed before. Winning was not the only objective. Controlling the war became part of the objective. The intervention in Korea transformed American policy in ways that extended far beyond the peninsula. The abstract debates about how to respond to communist expansion suddenly had concrete form. The questions that had been discussed in memoranda and academic conferences now had to be answered with resources, with commitments, and with lives. The immediate effect was acceleration of everything that had been moving slowly. Plans that had been developing at bureaucratic pace were pushed forward with wartime urgency. Budgets that had been constrained by peacetime politics were expanded dramatically. The machinery of national security that had been built for the last war was adapted and enlarged for what was now understood to be a permanent condition of global confrontation. In a hearing room on Capitol Hill, budget officials presented revised appropriations requests that reflected the changed reality. The numbers were larger than anything peacetime planners had contemplated just months before. The committee members listened with a seriousness that reflected the moment. Peacetime assumptions no longer apply, the lead official explained. The force levels we planned for a world at peace are not adequate for a world at war. The numbers moved through the legislative process with speed that surprised even those who had requested them. In American homes, families absorbed the news that their country was at war again. The sons and husbands and brothers who had returned from the Pacific and Europe just 5 years earlier now faced the possibility of returning to combat. The sacrifices that had been made were not, it seemed, the end of sacrifice. The peace that had been won was not, it seemed, a lasting peace. A mother in Ohio read the newspaper reports with growing dread. Her son had enlisted in the army after the last war, thinking that military service in peacetime would be safer and more stable than the factory job that was his alternative. Now peacetime had ended without warning. She did not know where he would be sent or what he would face when he got there. She knew only that the world was more dangerous than she had allowed herself to believe. Radio broadcasts carried the news into every corner of the country. Commentators explained the stakes in terms that emphasized the global significance of what was happening. This was not just about Korea, they said. This was about the future of the free world, about whether aggression would be allowed to succeed, about whether the sacrifices of the last war would be validated or wasted. The political effects were immediate and lasting. The sense that the country faced a real and present danger strengthened the hand of those who argued for vigilance against all threats, external and internal. The atmosphere of crisis gave new energy to those who saw enemies everywhere and new legitimacy to measures that might have been questioned in calmer times. In other countries, the effects were equally profound. The intervention demonstrated that American commitments were real and would be backed by force. The doubts that had emerged after setbacks in Asia were partially offset by the willingness to fight in Korea. Allies who had wondered whether American promises could be relied upon now had evidence that at least under some circumstances they could. But the intervention also demonstrated the risks that came with alliance to American power. Being under American protection meant potentially being involved in American wars. The security that came from American commitment came with costs that were not always visible until the moment arrived to pay them. The Cold War stopped seeming like a competition of pressure and maneuver. It became something more immediate and more dangerous. A war that was being fought with real weapons against real enemies with real casualties. The first weeks of the conflict established patterns that would persist as the war continued. The initial shock of invasion gave way to determined response. The defending forces, reinforced by American troops rushed first from Japan and then from across the Pacific, gradually stabilized the situation. The complete conquest that had seemed imminent in those first chaotic days was prevented through desperate effort and considerable sacrifice. But prevention was not the same as victory. The forces that had invaded remained powerful and determined. The peninsula remained a battlefield with outcomes uncertain. The questions about objectives and limits remained unresolved and would be tested again as the situation evolved. The decisions made in June and July of 1950 shaped not just the immediate conflict but the entire structure of how the Cold War would be fought. The willingness to respond with force established a precedent that would be invoked for decades. The methods chosen for response, through international institutions and with coalition partners, established frameworks that would be used again and again. The limitations accepted in pursuit of controlled escalation established patterns that would recur in future conflicts around the world. The war would continue through phases that those who made the initial decisions could not fully anticipate. New participants would enter and transform the nature of the conflict. The battle lines would shift dramatically before settling into exhausted stalemate. The costs would mount far beyond what anyone expected in those first urgent days. But all of that lay in the future as the summer of 1950 unfolded. What was clear in those first weeks was that a threshold had been crossed. The Cold War had become a shooting war. The theories of containment were being tested not in seminars but on battlefields where people were dying. The commitment made in those first days could not be easily reversed. The credibility that had been staked could not be withdrawn without consequences that seemed worse than pressing forward. The war would have to be fought to some kind of conclusion, whatever form that conclusion eventually took. The first test was on the ground. But the war would expand into other dimensions that would test both sides in new ways. Korea was the first test of containment on land. Then it became the first true jet war in the sky, and the place where that rivalry peaked had a name pilots would never forget: MiG Alley.